Well, the big story this week, after only 13 hours of jury deliberation, a guilty verdict was reached in the Aurora Theater shooting trial on Thursday. The trial now enters the punishment phase, where the defendant does face the death penalty. Patty, we were just talking about before the show started of who was surprised and not surprised at the speed. You and I were both surprised of how quickly the jury was able to turn this around. Not that there's a whole lot of doubt about guilt, but there's a lot of things to consider. I mean, they had hours and days, weeks of testimony. Besides the speed of the decision, what did you think about it coming to this resolution so far?
Well, we had about as many weeks of testimony as we had hours of deliberation, so I was surprised. I was also, I have to say, pleasantly, although it's a hard word to even use in this, pleasantly surprised that the trial went as smoothly as it did. The coverage wasn't excessive. People generally behaved themselves. Nothing disastrous seemed to happen. It was speedier than we thought. It was really fascinating as you started hearing more about the jurors to realize what an incredible caliber of Coloradans served on that jury, were willing to be out there for months, and it could have been much longer than it was. I was surprised that I think guilty was going to be inevitable the way this trial went. I still wish that the original plea agreement had been taken, so we would have been spared the trial and we would have had him in prison for the rest of his life. Now we're going to go through what I think may cause a lot more upheaval and discussion on where Colorado is on the death penalty.
Mm-hmm. David, you're one of our two esteemed lawyers on the panel today. I was very impressed as a layperson watching Judge Carlos Zamora. It seemed to be a textbook style of how to handle a high-profile case, which we don't always see from judges around the country. Did I see it accurately as a layperson?
Oh, I think so. I think he was like Judge Maich, the federal judge who presided over the Timothy McVeigh trial for the Oklahoma City bombing, and the opposite of Judge Ito from the O.J. television, O.J. Simpson cable TV series we had a couple decades ago. The prosecution in this case had the burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant met the standard of sanity for this purpose, which is knowing right from wrong. On the one hand, you had conflicting testimony from psychiatrists on each side. On the other hand, you had unquestioned evidence of long-time deliberation, planning, and deception by the perpetrator. So it may be that the jury, taking that this was not an impulsive crime where somebody suddenly went into a psychotic phase and did something. That certainly happens with people who are mentally ill. That even taking into account the mental illness here, the long-term nature of it showed enough knowledge and responsibility that he can be held accountable. But I'd say if the verdict had come out the other way, I would also have deferred to the jury, because they're the only ones who sat through the whole thing. Maybe the folks in the media did, I suppose, too, but none of us at this table saw every minute of that trial, including every minute of the psychiatric testimony. So that's our great system of government, where 12 people with common sense and varied life experiences come together and decide collectively.
Penn, you're our other esteemed lawyer. What did you think of the cases presented, and did that lead to the speed of the jury deliberations?
You know, I think it did. To your prior point with David, I think Judge Zamora ran a very good trial, very efficient, very professional. And we have to give credit to the jurors, and I should say the remaining jurors, because remember, at one point, we had so much attrition on the panel, there was a question whether you'd have enough to finish this thing. I wasn't surprised by the speed of the verdict, though. As I just caught snippets of how the trial was proceeding, I thought it was very clear, which is partly why I was hoping the plea agreement would have been reached on the front end. It seemed very clear that this was clearly planned, premeditated, and predetermined actions by this perpetrator. So guilt wasn't the issue. The question was whether he was legally responsible for his conduct. And it'll be fascinating to see if the jury talks after this, because some judges let you talk to jurors, some don't. I'd be fascinated to know if they decided, based on the non-expert testimony, that this guy was legally sane and accountable, and that they just looked at the competing experts as whether it would tip them back the other direction. But I thought the evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution, I thought, did a very good job. The defense did what they could with what they had. But it very much just at one glance struck me as a guy who was perfectly sane and rational, and once he got arrested, he lost his mind. And I think maybe that's how the jurors took it. 13 hours to deliberate with 160 some counts. They probably spent 6 hours filling out the verdict forms. So I would imagine that their decision was probably made pretty rapidly.
Mm-hmm. Ben, I mean, I was not only impressed with Judge Carlos Moore, but I was also impressed with how the Denver media handled this entire trial. And I realize we still have a punishment phase to go through, but I saw yesterday a lot of focus on the victims. Mm-hmm. You still saw a lot of focus on the Aurora Theater Trial, not mentioning the defendant's name. Mm-hmm. It seemed maybe it's just a sad result of all the experience we have as a community with crimes like this, that we handled this one, we did it right. What'd you think?
I would agree, and I would also agree with your supposition that it's based on experience. I thought as we learned the profiles of the individuals on the jury, and the foreman, of course, being a former Columbine student and friends with the perpetrators there, and also friends with some of the victims, we have gone through this before, and I think that our media has learned the lesson very clearly of how to treat these things and how sensitive it is. So I think that the media has done a remarkably good job of being sensitive, of trying to give coverage to the victims and their families and the fallout, as opposed to focusing on the perpetrator, which I think we see in the media and how these things repeat themselves. That is what a lot of these people are looking for, is that attention. So I think the media does deserve quite a bit of praise for their subtle coverage.